So today's lesson will be about how to evaluate a trig function using the idea of a reference angle and your memory of the first quadrant of the unit circle. So I'll walk you guys through how you would do this if you had to refer to the unit circle. However, you should get to a comfort level with the unit circle to which you would know cosine of pi over 6 is radical 3 over 2 without having to refer back to the unit circle. So that part of it is the memory part of it. I would highly recommend that as soon as possible you memorize the first quadrant of the unit circle. And I tell a lot of my students this, but I know when I taught the upper levels of math like Calculus BC that oftentimes students will say that the one thing that they wish they had done better before was memorize the unit circle. It will just make your life so much easier as we move forward into pre-calc honors and then to Calc BC. So let me first show you what you would do if as you're beginning these problems, how to find the values on your unit circle. So first of all, you're gonna if the value of the angle that they're asking you to evaluate the trig function on is not within the first quadrant, you can still use the first quadrant values to help you by finding the reference angle. And so I show you these steps here. Step 1 and 2 is finding the reference angle and then figuring out whether that trig function sine, cosine, tangent is positive or negative in that particular quadrant to then assign the value. So for example, cosine of pi over 6. Well, pi over 6, the reference angle for pi over 6 is in the first quadrant. So what I would do is if I don't have this value memorized yet, I associate cosine with the x coordinate. So let me go ahead and show you guys. This is the unit circle that we had populated the day before. So let's see, unit circle intro. So I would go to my unit circle since it was pi over 6, that's the 30-degree angle. So that's the triangle that's highlighted in the first quadrant. I would go to the x value of that quadrant, x value of that angle measure. So pi over 6, the x value is radical 3 over 2. That x value is positive in that quadrant because x is positive. And let me undo that and then go back now to my notes. And what we would do is say that since the x value is positive and radical 3 over 2, that would be my answer, positive radical 3 over 2. Now, cosine pi over 6 is one of those things at some point you just memorize. So you should be able to think automatically it's radical 3 over 2 and then assign us whether it's positive or negative. 3 pi over 4. Now, the nice thing about the radian unit of measure is that the denominator gives you your reference angles. So 3 pi over 4, I just need a picture where that is in the unit circle. That's in the second quadrant because it's 1 pi over 4 away from 4 pi over 4. So I know my reference angle, so I'll say theta reference angle is pi over 4. And from there, I want to note what quadrant that is in. 3 pi over 4 is in quadrant 2. And then think about whether sine is positive or negative in quadrant 2. Well, the sine is a y value. And so then the y value is positive in that quadrant. And then from there, what is sine of pi over 4? In the sine of pi over 4, and if you just have the first quadrant memorized, sine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. And so my answer is positive radical 2 over 2. That's how you would do it using just the first quadrant values. Now, if you memorize the whole unit circle, some students, what they'll do is they'll sketch out the whole full unit circle with all the angle measures in degrees and radians before a test and then just pull the x and y values accordingly. So again, for part C, now we see that we have again, a radian mode. So radian unit of measure. So 4 means that my reference angle is also going to be equal to pi over 4. Negative pi over 4 is a negative revolution, a clockwise revolution, which would put me in the fourth quadrant. So I'm going to determine my quadrant from there. In the fourth quadrant, is tangent positive or negative? So if I use all students take calculus, then C means that cosine is the only one that's positive in that quadrant. So which indicates that tangent would be negative. And that is true because in the fourth quadrant, you have x's and y's are opposite in signs, and tangent is y over x. So the next thing I would do is find what tangent of pi over 4 is equal to. Well, tangent is if you're looking at the coordinate points for what pi over 4 is, you have the x and y coordinate. We know that tangent is y over x. And since y over x is rad 2 over 2, we have the ratio of two values that are the same. So our answer would be -1, where the value is negative and the ratio is rad 2 over 2 over rad 2 over 2. Okay, so sine of 135. Another tip to you guys for the in degree is if it ends in 5, most likely it's going to be one of the values that has a reference angle of 45 degrees. So 135 puts us in the second quadrant, 45 degrees shy of 180 degrees. So my reference angle is 45 degrees. I figure out what quadrant that's in, and it's in quadrant 2. Is sine positive or negative in quadrant 2? Sine is y, so it's positive in quadrant 2. And then from there, what is sine of 45 degrees? So sine of 45 degrees, I would go back to my unit circle, look up 45 degrees if I haven't memorized it, look at the y value, and find that it's equal to radical 2 over 2. Okay, let's try cosine of 210. Well, 210 is more than 180 degrees. If we think of how far past 180 degrees it is, we find that the reference angle is 30 degrees. What quadrant is it in if we went 30 degrees past? Well, that would put us in quadrant 3. In quadrant 3, is cosine positive or negative? Cosine is negative in that quadrant. So I'm going to go back to my unit circle in the first quadrant, look up 30 degrees, and cosine is the x value at 30 degrees, and I see that the x value is rad 3 over 2. So negative rad 3 over 2. Again, if you have the full unit circle out in front of you, then you would go back and try to find 210 degrees on the unit circle and just look up the x value. So evaluate cosine of negative 120 degrees. So if I go negative 120 degrees, that's going to put me, we're going to go ahead and go a clockwise direction, and it would put me at 60 degrees away from pi, or away from 180 degrees. So my reference angle is the angle formed by the terminal side and the x-axis, so that would be 60 degrees. I'm in quadrant 3, where cosine is negative, and then I would find cosine of 60 degrees. Cosine of 60 degrees is 1/2, or the x value at 60 degrees in the first quadrant is 1/2. So my overall answer is -1/2 because of the fact that we are in quadrant 3. Okay, and a couple other, one other thing I'm going to mention is the quadrantal values. So if you get questions like sine of pi over 2, you're going to think of, and these are the points that, or the angle measures that fall on the x and y axis. You're going to think of, well, where is pi over 2? Pi over 2 is on top. The coordinate point is 0, 1, and sine is positive in that at that angle measure, so +1 would be the solution to that. So for example, if you were asked for cosine of negative pi would put you at the negative x-axis, where the coordinate point is -1, 0. Cosine is x, and the x value is -1.